I'm Rachel from Rachel Tutors English Online, and today I'm going to introduce to you the idea of the quotation sandwich in order to add textual evidence into your writing. When I think about a sandwich, I think about the layers that make up the sandwich. For example, if I were making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I would have a piece of bread, and then the peanut butter, the jelly, and another piece of bread. The idea of the quotation sandwich is exactly the same, where you follow the same structure for each quotation sandwich you make, regardless of what quote you are using or what your topic is about. So how do you make a quotation sandwich? First, you're going to want to write a sentence that answers the prompt. Next, you're going to want to include either a full sentence or simply a phrase to give some background context to the quote before introducing the quote. This is important because you always want to pretend that your reader has no idea what you're going to be talking about. So adding in some background context for where the quote comes from is really important. Then you will write the actual quote, and depending on the type of citations you are using, most likely at the end of the quote in parentheses, you will add the author's last name and the page number where you found the quote. This is the MLA style of in-text citations, which is commonly used for papers relating to literature. Finally, you will add a sentence after the quote that explains the quote as well as how it connects to the original prompt and how it supports your answer. Now, before I share an example with you, I would like to give you some examples of how to introduce the quote as well as how to introduce the sentence following the quote. After you've introduced the quote with some background context, you're going to want to use a phrase that leads into the quote. Some phrase options include the author writes. For example, this is shown when blank says or said, and the narrator or text states. Then we have the sentence following the quote. I call this sentence the unpacking sentence because it's the sentence that unpacks the quote and helps the reader understand how the quote relates to your answer to the prompt. There are a few phrases you could use to introduce this sentence, and these include, this supports the idea that, this shows, this demonstrates, this means, this suggests, and in other words. Now let's look at an actual example of how this all comes together. For my example, I'm going to use a prompt that I gave to one of my actual writing students. And the prompt is this: describe Gretel from The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. It's totally fine if you haven't read this book. You will still be able to understand my illustration using this. Gretel is the main character's sister in this book, and so I asked my student to describe her. And so now I'm going to share how I would make a quotation sandwich for this prompt. So I'm going to start by answering the prompt, and here I've written Gretel is selfish. Now the next step is to include some background information to the quote before introducing the quote itself. So the way I've decided to introduce it is using this. During a conversation between Gretel and Maria, when Gretel wants to take a bath, here I'm giving some context to this quote that Gretel is going to be speaking in just a moment. Now I want to include one of those smaller phrases that I mentioned that you add right before putting in the actual quote. So I'm going to do that next. I opted to use the text states, and this is because the dialogue included has some narration, and so it's not just a direct quote from the character herself. There's some narration involved. So I'm going to introduce the quote from a narrative perspective as opposed to being from the character's perspective. And now I'm going to simply add in the quote. So during a conversation between Gretel and Maria, when Gretel wants to take a bath, the text states, "Well, don't be long," said Gretel rudely, because unlike Bruno, she never stopped to think about the fact that Maria was a person with feelings just like hers. So I've stated that Gretel is selfish. Now I'm including a quote that shows that she's selfish. And the last thing to do is to include my unpacking sentence. I'm going to start with one of those phrases that I talked about. So I chose to use the phrase, "this shows," and the whole sentence says, "This shows that Gretel is more focused on her own needs and her own timeline than on Maria and her many responsibilities." So the structure again is as follows. I answered the question, the prompt. I included background information to the quote. I included a phrase before introducing the quote. I included a phrase before introducing my unpacking sentence, and then I added my unpacking sentence. Just to clarify, this is a quotation sandwich. This is not a full paragraph. I will get to that in a future video of how to include quotation sandwiches into paragraphs. So now you know the basic structure of how to incorporate textual evidence into your writing to support your overarching arguments. Stay tuned for future videos further explaining how you can incorporate textual evidence into your writing. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you would like to stay up to date on future videos that will help you with your writing, then please hit the subscribe button. And I'll see you in my next video.